Check, check. Hello, everybody. Good morning. Welcome to Word for Women. It is see, you can tell that they like this series because as soon as I started talking, everybody stopped talking because they know you're here. So thank you very much. Welcome to Word for Women. We are continuing in our Many Faiths series. So a couple of weeks ago, we had an overview and talked about Christianity. And then we talked about these are just broad brush strokes because we can't learn everything there is to know about other religions in 40 minutes each week. So hold all of this we're getting just a snippet, a little snapshot of what it's like from actual faith leaders. So 2 weeks ago, we learned about Buddhism. Last week, we learned about Islam. Today, we are pleased to welcome Rabbi Harold Kravitz from Adath Jeshurun congregation. I apologize for mispronouncing that. In Minnetonka, Minnesota. He'll introduce himself a little bit more in just a second, but we are so glad that you are here. He is the Rabbi Emeritus, which is something we know a little bit about of having emeriti pastors around. And you get to hear, hopefully he'll share a little bit about that journey as well and just what being an emeritus rabbi is all about. He has an extensive presentation because, as you know, faith traditions, there's a lot to say. So he's going to go through it kind of quickly and leave time for questions in the end. If you don't mind, I would like to go until 10:30 is when I won't stop it at about the 10:15 like we normally do, just to give you a little bit extra time with Rabbi Kravitz here. Just so you know, and then I'll have my 5-minute sign towards the end, and we'll kind of wrap things up so you can get to small groups. All right, and with that, I'm going to pass it over to Rabbi.
Thank you. Well, I have to say, clergy are prone to exaggerate numbers. I don't know if you're aware of that, but actually, your pastor, Forster, who told me she likes to be called Pastor Caitlin, actually undersold the numbers. So I thank you for being so honest. So just briefly, and also I want to thank our member of our congregation, Ann Miller. Where are you, Ann? Yes, who got me into this trouble. I asked, how'd you come to our synagogue? And they said, well, one of your members is friends with one of our dear people. And I said, who? I said, oh, Ann Miller. Oh, yeah. Hers was the first bat mitzvah I ever officiated at on my own in 1987 when my senior colleague had to leave for a family emergency, and I got to do her wedding and their kids' b'nai mitzvah, and so it's been a long run. So we have a very special relationship. Just to answer questions already been asked of me, so our congregation, it's actually been around since 1884. It's about 1,100 households, we're in our 5th building. We started in a storefront on Washington Avenue, had a building or two by around where the U.S. Bank Stadium is, and then we're in South Minneapolis at 34th and DuPont till 1990, from 1927, 1991, and then moved out and opened our building, which now is off of Hopkins Crossroad and Cedar Lake Road, right behind Hopkins High School. And it's a conservative congregation, and when we say conservative, and I'll maybe have time to get back to that later, it's one of the movements in Judaism, and it's the movement that tries to balance tradition and change. So when we say conservative, that's not a political description. We're not politically conservative. It's a religious concept that we seek to conserve tradition at the same time that we respond to change. Maybe I'm getting to the last slide, but one person kind of wittily or slyly said about movements in Judaism, he said, well, there's Orthodox, there's conservative and middle, there's Reform, there are other movements, but he described the Orthodox as high and crazy. He described the Reform as low and lazy. He described conservative as middle and hazy. So a little flippant, a little disrespectful, but not entirely untrue. And yeah, Rabbi Emeritus, you know about Emeritus, and I'm really very fortunate that I succeeded my predecessor, who's Barry Citron, who's still on our staff as senior scholar, and my younger colleague of 13 years has succeeded me as our senior rabbi, Aaron Weininger. So we're very fortunate to have a wonderful staff team. And when this request went to them, they said, oh, let's have Rabbi Kravitz do it. It's like, oh, he's retired. He's got time. So, okay. So here I am. and I'm really delighted to be with you and learn about your congregation. So I just want to start by asking people to just tell me, like, what experience do you have of Judaism or the Jewish people? Are there, I put a bunch of questions. Have you attended a life cycle, read something? How many people have attended a life cycle at a synagogue? Okay, so not so many. Read something about Judaism. Okay, bigger response. Have Jewish friends? All right, Jewish relatives? Just a few, okay. So the first thing I want to address is, so how does one define Judaism or Jewishness? I think that's really an important point to make as we get started, because Judaism is not like many other faiths. I can only compare it to one example, but let me just give you a definition that I've always found valuable. Judaism is an evolving religious civilization. So what does that mean? When you say, so what's this? Obviously religious, but when you say civilization, what does a civilization consist of? Now it's your turn. I'm going to speak a lot here, so you better help me here. What's a civilization involve? Right? When you say it's not just a religion, you think about faith, belief, practice. What's civilization imply? A lifestyle. Okay. What else does civilization imply? A community. What else? Culture, for sure. Other things? Language. We'll talk briefly about language. Anything? Rules, maybe. Maybe a land. Often associate a civilization with a land. Judaism includes all of those things. Kaplan would have said that religion is at the center of that civilization, but it's much bigger than that. And he, and certainly our movement, always has put a big emphasis on peoplehood, right? Peoplehood. And I think if you look at Jewish history, and we're going to do a really fast sweep of a lot of Jewish history today, you'll see that Judaism has always kind of had this tension between the religious dimensions and the national dimensions that speak to peoplehood. And they've always been in different balances at different times, but forever. Like you look in the Bible, and you see there were religious leaders. What are the types of religious leaders you encounter in the Hebrew Bible, which is what we call it, as opposed to the Old Testament, which is what Christians may use to refer to it? What are some of the models of religious leaderships? What? Prophets, right? The role of the prophet is actually to relate to the non-religious leader, the king, or the civil leader, the king, and to tell the king, it's an amazing role, what you're doing is not okay. To tell the people, as they did all the time to the Jewish people and to Israelites, what you're doing is wrong. You're on the wrong course. God wants you to do fill in the blank. Prophets were not popular, let's just say, and they tended to be a little crazy. They were, out there really presenting a very challenging message to the people. What other kinds of leadership do you encounter in the Hebrew Bible? What? Actually, you don't encounter rabbis in the Hebrew Bible. We'll talk about when they show up. They're much later. Wait, but what's the other religious model that you encounter? We heard about prophets. We heard about kings, right? The religious and secular, or relatively secular. Because kings were supposed to study the scripture as well, but... Okay, we'll talk about Pharisees and who they are. They come much later. What about okay, that's already not so much biblical, it's post-biblical. But so we talked about prophets and kings, judges, right, in later books, judges who basically are military leaders they're not really judges like in a court sense. They arise to lead the people in times, military leaders who come up in times of change. But also priests, right? Priests are very important. In Hebrew, we call them Kohen or Levites, the priests, and we'll talk more about who they were. But they are they are in charge of the ritual of the Jewish people in the Bible. So we'll talk about how we get to rabbis. They come much later. Often when people teach Judaism, they talk about three categories of God, Torah, and Israel. And I'm going to do a quick version of that, but not in that order. I'm going to start with Torah. And what you're looking at is a scroll of the Torah, which if you come to our synagogue, which you're certainly welcome to do for services, you'll find that we have kind of in the synagogue, doesn't take much to have a synagogue. You need an ark that holds the scroll of the Torah and a light, an eternal light, and that's about it. Reading table and a group of people to form a community for prayer. That's all it takes. Buildings, we have a gorgeous building, but you can create a synagogue anywhere in one room. When we talk about the scroll, so I found this is really maybe not the easiest to read, but it goes from right to left, as does Hebrew. You'll see the 5 books that are found in that scroll of the Torah, which is, scroll of the Torah is always the same no matter what kind of synagogue you enter. And like 5 books of Moses we often speak about. In Hebrew, we refer to that as the Torah, which the prophets, the Nevi'im, and the writings, Ketuvim, and that acronym from Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim spells the word Tanakh, which is what we refer to in Hebrew as the Hebrew Bible. We don't use the term or consider all that respectful to speak to us about Old Testament, because that suggests that that text has been superseded. We can get into that later. So another feature of Jewish sacred text is that this notion that really is really advanced by rabbis who are much later form of religious leadership, post-biblical actually, is that the Torah was given at Mount Sinai, given by God to Mount Sinai as revelation, which is a common belief that we have, but it was given not only in the written form, but also in an oral form, an oral tradition. And that tradition was handed down from one teacher to the next for teaching and interpretation, that you can't understand the written version without referencing the oral teaching about it. And so there are some things on the left are things that our traditions have in common, although the order in which books are included in the Bible might differ. But what's on the right, that's really a Jewish idea, that this is to be interpreted through rabbinic understanding, which again develops much later, really in the Second Temple period. And I will take questions if people have questions, but I mostly want to hold them to the end unless I ask a question that I'm going to ask you to respond to. And this is a rich tradition, so you can't read the text of the Bible or of the 5 books of Moses, the Torah, and assume that that's what Judaism means. A very famous example that is often misunderstood is often in the Torah it says, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, right? A life for a life. Well, even Martin Luther King once said, well, if you accept that principle, you're going to have a lot of people without eyes, without teeth, without life. Well, I'm sorry, he was a great man. I respect him enormously, but he didn't understand that passage properly, or even the fact that in biblical times, that actually was an advancement, because what is the principle behind that? That every life has the same value. In a world in which if you were a landowner and you were a serf, well, there wasn't the same law applied to you. The Bible's asserting a principle of everyone is equal in the eyes of God. And furthermore, the rabbi said, and it doesn't mean literally that if somebody knocks out a tooth, you take a tooth, or God forbid, a life. It means the value of a tooth, the value. So I had the question, well, how do you determine the value of a tooth? Well, anybody, who works in the insurance business knows that there's ways to do that. So again, you can't just read the biblical text and assume that that's what Judaism teaches. In fact, it's not. You have to look at it through the oral tradition. That's a little bit on Torah in its broadest sense. Now we'll talk about Israel. So Israel, right, different meanings. Israel in the Torah refers to the patriarch Jacob, right? Abraham, Sarah, Jacob, Isaac, and Rebekah, Jacob, Rachel, and Leah, who is the father of the sons who become the tribes of Israel. And at some point in the famous wrestling match, Jacob's renamed Israel, which actually means one who wrestles with God. And that's an interesting notion that as Jews we take very seriously, that it means to be somebody who wrestles with God. It also refers to the people, right? I talked about peoplehood. The children of Israel, Bnei Yisrael, or the house of Israel, and a land, the land of Israel. And you see I have a little Hebrew up there, including So it gets us to the issue of language. There are multiple languages in Jewish civilization. Hebrew is the language of sacred text. In the time of Jesus, which is also the time of the rabbis, which we're going to talk more about, the language of the people was Aramaic. So, for example, when I mentioned the Talmud, that source of oral tradition, it's all in Aramaic. There's other languages of the Jewish people, but I don't want to spend a lot of time. But the one you probably know the most is Yiddish. And a lot of words, mostly curse words, have entered the American vocabulary from Yiddish. But again, that's its own lecture. I'm not going to. Uh-oh. I think I messed this up here. Oh, there we go. Why is it not working? Dum, 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 dum. All right, well, my thing froze. Give me a second, and I'll get back. I didn't account for my time presentation. Okay. There we go. So now let's talk about that third, right? God, Torah, Israel, God. I figured I shouldn't come and talk about Judaism without mentioning God, right? Judaism is often described as monotheistic. This phrase, which used to be inscribed on the front of our building on DuPont Avenue, and I lost the debate about what should be inscribed on our building on DuPont, and that's a whole other conversation. But very important. Hear, O Israel, Adonai is our God. Adonai is the word that often translated as Lord. Adonai is one, right? Monotheism, there it is in Hebrew, in the script that you would see it in the Torah. And so what does that mean? So Rabbi Milton Steinberg, brilliant guy who was writing in the middle of the 20th century, has a great chapter that I often use, right? God is one means there is unity to the natural and moral universe. God is one means not many, right? Not idolatry as we understand it in Judaism. God is one means not two, right? Which is dualism, Gnosticism, Zoroastrianism, that has this idea of deities, a battle between power, light and darkness. God is one, not three. We don't affirm notions of Trinity, although we do have, as Trinity can be explained, I believe, notions of different aspects of God. And I think, which is why I think rabbis have considered Christianity a monotheistic religion, and God is one, not none. So God is certainly an important Jewish principle, but we may not agree as Jews, we certainly don't agree on what we mean when we speak about God. And that can range from very much God intervening in the world and in history and in individuals' lives, to those like Mordecai Kaplan, who I mentioned, who reject supernatural concepts of God and talked about God as a power that makes for good in the world, or salvation, to use fancy religious language. So here's a great story, one of my favorites, that I think just gives you a little taste of some of this, of how the rabbis, what they brought to this in interpreting, because they were the source of all that oral tradition. That was where rabbis came in, as opposed to priests who were running the temple ritual and offering animal sacrifices as a way to serve God. Don't think if you come to a synagogue, because you saw in the Bible, it's all about animal sacrifice. You're not going to see any of that in the synagogue. In a few minutes, we'll see why. But this great story, right? A certain Gentile came before one of the great rabbis of the first century BCE, before the Common Era, which is what Jews refer to as CE and AD, and said, "I'll convert on the condition that you teach me the entire Torah while I'll stand on one foot." Shammai was known to not be the most patient of people, and he basically picked up like a ruler and chased the guy out the door. This person then came to Hillel, a very important teacher of that period, who did go forward with conversion and said all he did was, what is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor. Well, you recognize that as the golden rule. It's found in Leviticus 19:18 in a positive form. That's a whole discussion about why the negative and positive. And certainly find in the New Testament. And he goes on to say to the person, that is the entire Torah, meaning both written and oral, and all of what is at the core principle. The rest is commentary. Now go and study. So it's a great story about Judaism and about Hillel and how he understood what was the core principle. Lots of debates about what is the core principle. Just like everything else in Judaism, the rabbis and the Jews never agree on anything. So, okay, so I want to take us to the Second Temple period as we're zipping along through Jewish history. The temple in Jerusalem, like that was the center. There was a previous temple, it was destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 BC. This was kind of where it all happened. And all those animal sacrifices you read about in the Bible, they're described as having in the portable sanctuary, the Mishkan, that they built in the desert, which we're now in the middle of reading about in our synagogue in the weekly liturgical calendar. Eventually, it gets replaced by this building that was considered one of the most magnificent buildings of its time, built by Herod, who was a king, controversial king, because he came from a people called the Idumeans. He converted to Judaism, but he was very much serving the Roman Empire that was in power by the 1st century BCE. Magnificent and really central building. This is where the priests were doing their things. Rabbis were not involved in this. Rabbis were teachers and judges applying the law of the Torah to the daily life of the Jewish people through the use of the written and the oral tradition. So basically teachers, judges, and elders of the community. During that period, as you can see the dates of it, somebody asked about Pharisees. There were different sectarian groups that were all part of the Jewish people. There was not one Judaism. Sadducees, who were they? Basically represented the priestly class responsible for the temple. Lived all over the country. They would come in different circuits to the temple to administer the sacrifice. They also lived right outside the quarter of that magnificent building, and we actually find archaeological remains of them. The Pharisees, that's what Jews call the rabbis. And so although you find in New Testament disparaging terms about the Pharisees, Jesus was likely a Pharisee of the school of Hillel, which we're going to get to in a minute. The Essenes, and that's rabbinic tradition, links itself to the Pharisees. The Essenes were a separatist group that went off into the desert. If you've ever heard of the Dead Sea sect or Dead Sea Scrolls, that's probably who that was. There's some speculation that John the Baptist was connected to them. They did a lot with ritual purity and water, and you find actually archaeological examples of ritual baths that they built in the desert as part of their culture. And zealots. Who were the zealots? Well, the zealots, this was the period when Rome was in charge, certainly the 1st century CE, onward until pretty much for centuries. The zealots advocated for throwing off the yoke of the Roman Empire, which is fairly controversial because that's what it means to go against power. So this is a period when early Christianity is formed. It raises the question of who was Jesus, who were the early followers of Jesus, and I am absolutely going to defer to Pastor Caitlin to answer that question another day, because that's much too complicated for me. But I do want to just actually ask you a question. What do you think of this statement? Christianity is a religion of love, and Judaism is a religion of law. How many of you have heard that said before as a way of characterizing? So not so many people. It's very common, I think, among Christian thinkers to describe the difference that way. And Jews would absolutely reject that distinction. There's a magnificent book that is written for Jews. It's written for Christians. It's written for anybody, called Judaism is About Love, Recovering the Heart of Jewish Life by Rabbi Shai Held. It's a phenomenal book that I'm just studying and teaching with a study group at our synagogue, which I still am involved in. And just take a look at this statement. We are loved, Judaism teaches, because God loves us, not because of anything we have done or accomplished, but simply because we are created in God's image, which is a core teaching of Judaism, which Christianity shares. And now here we have one of the rabbis, Rabbi Kiba, said, "Beloved is the human being, for the humans were created in the image of God, and it's not something we have to earn, but something we ought to strive to live up to." And this is a good definition of Judaism's vision of the spiritual life, the attempt to live up to God's love. That is a very big statement. I can't do justice to it, but he sees it as undergirding commitments to justice, commitments to loving and care for the stranger, how love your neighbors yourself. Entire world orientation is really grounded in Judaism's fundamental commitment to love. And yes, we do rely, in certainly some of our movements, on law as an important way that we structure our values and practice them. So again, very deep. But I want to come back to this issue of the Roman Empire. So yeah, they had a dilemma, right? The Romans brought their roads and their aqueducts throughout the ancient world, but they also brought their gladiators and their prostitutes and everything else that was not such a wonderful aspect, and their cruelty, frankly. So the question was how to deal with them. Well, basically the temple priests, right, the Sadducees, it pretty much was about going along with the reigning power. Among the Pharisees, the rabbis, you had somebody like Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, who really said, no, look, let us do our thing. We're not going to throw off the yoke of Rome, so let's figure out how to work around them. And then, as I mentioned, the Zealots, who led a revolt and actually eventually succeeded and start what becomes a war against Rome. Doesn't turn out so well. Right? In the year 70, the temple, which is the primary religious institution and way of expressing oneself spiritually, is destroyed by the Romans, and the Jews are exiled for the second time. Right? The Babylonians exiled us. We return. Second time we're exiled. Somebody have a question? No. Okay. Here's a text that conveys this, that so powerfully put in the mouth of Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, who I mentioned, who's with one of his students near Jerusalem after this cataclysm. And the student says, at the temple, it says, "Alas for us, the place which atoned for the sins of the people of Israel through the ritual of animal sacrifice lies in ruins." So just take a minute to understand like how big a crisis this is. In ancient Israel, before you could eat of your field, you had to bring a certain amount of that. You know, like there's tithing, right? All that comes from that sort. You had to bring it to the temple. You had to share it with the priests because that's how they were taken care of, because they didn't have a portion of the land as the rest of the tribes did. Before you could eat, partake of your animals, you had to offer certain animals for sin offerings, for well-being offerings, Thanksgiving offerings, things that happen on a regular basis in the ancient temple in Jerusalem. So this is like a huge crisis. Like, how do we function? And it was Yochanan ben Zakkai who got permission from the Romans before the temple was destroyed to go out of the city to a place that is very close to where Gaza is today, and to establish a new Jewish center for learning, where he basically creates a Judaism that can function in the absence of a temple, with the hope that a Messiah will come and the temple will be restored. Still hasn't happened. Some of us are more eager for that to happen than others. That's a whole other topic. But here's Ben Zakkai's response. "Be not grieved, my son. There is another way of gaining atonement, even though the temple is destroyed. We must now gain atonement through gemilut chasadim, acts of loving kindness, for it is written, for I desire chesed, loving kindness, and not sacrifice." Hosea 6:6. So basically, he's the one who's responsible for creating what we call Judaism, which is mobile, right? It's not linked to one religious center in Jerusalem. It can move anywhere. And here's another rabbi who teaches in a collection of wisdom called Pirkei Avot, the wisdom of the sages, which is, again, oral Torah that was handed down. Simon, or Shimon the Righteous, who was from leftover of the Great Assembly, or the Sanhedrin, which was the body of rabbis who ruled on law during the temple period. He would say, on three things the world stands: on Torah, study, so that can continue, right? That can continue to function. On service, avodah, which meant in temple times the offering of animals and plants and crops at the temple, but now becomes prayer, and on acts of loving kindness, which was continuing. And that, by the way, our synagogue's mission statement, that's at the core of our mission statement. We're not original. It's probably true of any Jewish religious institution, is based on those three pillars of Torah, learning, avodah, spiritual practice, prayer, no longer sacrifice, and acts of kindness. By the way, while the temple existed, there was always another central important institution, the synagogue. The synagogue, which we have evidence of it existing as early as post the first exile after the destruction of the Second Temple in 586 BC, and it continues. I left out a word, I have to fix that. And it basically is a place of assembly, right? Beit Knesset means the house of assembly, where Jews gathered. It's a house of prayer, Beit HaTfilah, which, again, in the early period, was not in place of, it was not the central religious practice. It was kind of complementary. You would, for example, when the temple ritual was going on, if you were not in Jerusalem, you could read what happened, and reading it was as if you were participating in it. And the house of study. By the way, it also, the synagogue in ancient times is also like a hostel. People stop and like they can sleep there. So that institution, which is already created hundreds of years before the destruction of the Second Temple, for which we have archaeological examples in Israel from before the destruction of the Temple, has already formed. And that becomes part of how Jews are able to move or go on the move, to survive beyond the land of Israel. And it's clearly the source of the early church as well. Again, this is also the period after the destruction of the temple when we see the separation between the early founders of followers of Jesus and the founders of what becomes Christianity, who are Jews, right? So anything you read in the New Testament about the Pharisees or the Jews, this is basically an inter-Jewish debate. And you know how ugly those things can get. Well, they're pretty ugly, and we'll see the consequences of that later, which are quite profound. But as Rabbi Michael Cook, an important authority on the split between early Judaism and early Christianity, basically this was kind of one group that eventually splits, and clearly the Christianity is a whole lot more successful in growing, in part because of what happens in Rome in the 4th century, when the king, the emperor Constantine, converts to Christianity in 325 CE, or you might say AD, and eventually Christianity comes from being a persecuted minority, which Judaism wasn't. Judaism was an official religion of the Roman Empire, totally legal. Christianity was not. His conversion, that completely changes, and his successor establishes Christianity as Rome's state religion. And again, where's the pastor? You can talk about how, what that meant for Christianity, had some upsides, had some downsides. But in looking at the early discussion of Judaism by the church fathers, there's some pretty ugly stuff that emerges. Right? Jews are referred to as perfidious, right? The perfidious Jews, lying, it was their misconduct that was responsible for the destruction of the temple and the dispersion, the exile of the Jews, because the Jews failed to live up to the covenant and failed to recognize Jesus as Messiah and as Son of God. So we see the lines are now getting drawn to separate religion, and probably the most heinous accusation that Jews are accused of being Christ killers, right? Which, given that the Romans were in charge, that is simply, Jews didn't have that much power in those days. Courts were under the authority of Rome. So we get the beginning of Christian anti-Judaism, which has serious consequences. And then you can see anti-Jewish legislation, right? Here's the 5th century. This code strips Jews of citizenship and represses Judaism as a religion. Jews can't proselytize. They can't seek to bring new adherents. They outlaws marriage between Jews and Christians, forbids Jews from owning or dealing in slaves, which, was the commerce of the time, unfortunately. Forbids building of new synagogues, prohibits Jews from lucrative public positions, disqualifies Jews as witnesses against Christians in courts of law. So much so that over the course of 3 centuries, Jews became second-class citizens of Rome, and that status becomes entrenched in Europe for more than 1,000 years under the power of the church. This is a really, really thumbnail description of the Middle Ages. Jews, at a certain point, the establishment of the concept of a ghetto, where Jews have to live during the day and are separated from Christians. Jews in places are required to wear special hats or badges. There are accusations of blood libels. Horrible accusation as we're approaching Passover, that Jews used the blood of children, Christian children who they murder, to make matzah. okay, the food we eat during Passover, and expulsions, right? 1492, Jews of Spain are expelled. Jews are expelled from England, from other places. It's really important to say, and I wanted to just bring this up because it's hard and it's part of the history. That's not the whole story. Jews also thrived in places. There's a whole different story of Jews under Islam, but I felt I wanted to focus on this one because of where we are, particularly as we get to, we're in a Lutheran church, and I'm sorry to have to share this slide describing Martin Luther, who early in his career thought that Jews would convert. And so he tries to approach the Jewish people, and Jews being stiff-necked, they're not ready to give up their faith. He eventually turns quite anti-Jewish and writes this book, right, on the Jews and their lies. 7 measures he calls for of sharp mercy that he called on German princes to take against Jews. Burn their schools and synagogues, transfers Jews to community settlements, confiscate all Jewish literature, which was blasphemous, prohibit rabbis to teach on pain of death, deny Jews safe conduct so as to prevent the spread of Judaism, appropriate their wealth and use it to support converts and to prevent the lewd practice of usury. Let's talk about that for a minute. First of all, Jews in medieval Europe were prohibited from certain professions. They couldn't own land, and they couldn't join guilds, right? They couldn't practice any profession. So therefore were forced often into jobs that other people wouldn't take. One kind of out was that Christians couldn't lend money to each other, but they could borrow money from Jews. So that was an interesting kind of situation where Jews therefore end up becoming associated with money lending, which has its own consequences. Assign Jews to manual labors as a form of penance. So that's really hard. And again, Pastor Kaylee, where are you? It's all yours to discuss. I do just want to, I put this here just to shock you, but I also want to, I know that the Lutheran Church has done tremendous work in thinking about this heritage. And I remember going to a magnificent exhibit at Luther Seminary years ago on the anti-Jewish and anti-Semitic history of the Lutheran faith. And basically, it was unbelievably honest in putting this out and basically acknowledge it, and then asking the hard question, what's its relationship to the Holocaust? Right? And I have to say, it's incredibly admirable self-accounting that the Lutheran Church has taken post-Holocaust, and I think that just can't be understated. So I want to acknowledge it, but also just you have to grapple with it, your history, and we had to deal with the consequences. Now, the relationship of that to the next chapter is debatable, and there's no agreement on it. But you know, the Holocaust, I hope you are aware of it. It's the annihilation of 6 million of Europe's Jews. 1.5 of them are children. The question is, so what's the relationship between that legislation and hundreds of years of Christian persecution of Jews? And I put a quote from a person where I went to college, Gerard Sloyan, who's an expert Christian theologian, expert on anti-Judaism, anti-Semitism in the church. And he basically acknowledges that, you know, there's a lot to be wrestled with around the connection between anti-Christian practice. I mean, you hear what I described, right? Like special clothes, special badges, separated living. I mean, you know, where was that coming from? Hitler knew what, and his henchmen knew what they were doing. On the other hand, you know, I wouldn't claim they were Christians or acting as Christians. So really big topic. Not going to do it justice in the 3 minutes I have left. And to keep going, I think couldn't resist talking. I had to talk about Zionism. So it's in this context that you understand the formation of Zionism. Right, 1897, Theodor Herzl, who's a secular Jew, remember peoplehood, not religious, comes from a completely assimilated background, but sees in the aftermath of a famous trial of a captain of the French army, Alfred Dreyfus, who was accused and is proven to be purely anti-Semitic and having no basis. Herzl is a newspaper reporter who covers it, and he says Jews have only one choice. They will either assimilate or be destroyed by anti-Semitism. So we need a homeland. And he convenes Jews from many places in Basel, Switzerland, 1897, calling for a return to the land of Israel and the establishment of a Jewish state. Now again, really important to note, this builds on ancient hopes that have always been found in Jewish religious practice, return to Israel, return to Zion, and the attachment to the land of Israel. And the fact that Jews live continuously in the land of Israel throughout all of the things I described. There are always Jewish communities living there, sometimes in awful circumstances, oppressed by whoever was ruling. But it's always expressed in Jewish sacred texts, in Jewish daily prayer. And after the Holocaust, May 14th, 1948, Herzl's dream is realized in the establishment of the modern state of Israel. And frankly, amazingly, the rebirth of Hebrew as a spoken language, and trying to figure out how to take a biblical language, which was basically dead, and turn it into a language that could describe whatever, everything. Just to end with my 1 minute left, Jews coming to America, you see the kind of immigration, but the vast majority of Jews who live here come between 1880 and 1924. That's when my family came. I'm sure that's, and when your family came, from Russia and Eastern Europe. And then there were restrictions. We're not now, for the first time, in a period of anti-immigration movements and significant restrictions. And if you see the dates, it's probably why many of those Jews who would have fled Europe from Nazi persecution and obliteration couldn't leave. And more recently, there was a big influx of Jews from the former Soviet Union. Twin Minnesota's Jewish community is about 45,000. 4,000 Jews came from the former Soviet Union in the 80s to this community. Finally, as I said before, there are different movements in Judaism, and I reflect the conservative movements, kind of middle range, and I think that's it. I did it in 40 minutes. Woo. Okay. So that gives us, thank you. No, stop, because we got to. So that gives us 15 minutes for questions, and I'm open to anything you want to ask. Really, there's no topic I'm not willing to. And that's one thing about Judaism. There's no question that you can't ask. I may not have an answer, or more problematic, as I've always thought, is on the big questions in Judaism, there's not one answer. There are multiple answers, like, what do you believe about God? What do you believe about life after death? What do you believe about why bad things happen to good people? There's no one answer. So, yeah. But you're going to have to really speak up.
The synagogue that you had mentioned, when was the first synagogue built?
Well, there is archaeological evidence of synagogues in Babylonia from the period of the first exile, which is like 6th century, 5th century BCE. So old. So yeah, and there's many examples. You can go to Galilee and find many remnants of archaeological remnants of synagogues from before the destruction of the temple. And in a place in Egypt called Elephantine, I think it's 3rd century BCE, there's a famous archaeological dig of a synagogue. So ancient history is a whole study. Yeah.
Did Herzl see the birth of the country Israel?
No, he didn't. He left that conference I described, and he said, today I think I witnessed the birth of a new state of Israel. Herzl was complicated. I told you he wasn't a religious Jew. So when there was a possibility by the British to say, you know what, Palestine is too complicated, right? Palestine is the name assigned to that land by the Romans that applied and applied to Jews, including, right, until 1948, a Jew who lived in what we would call the land of Israel was considered Palestinian, as were the Arabs who were increasingly drawn to that area. There was an idea that it should be situated in Uganda, and he said, sounds good. Like, that sounds doable. And, again, the goal was to get Jews out of Europe to safety and to sovereignty and autonomy. Any Jew who had any knowledge said, like, what are you talking about? Like, have you ever looked at a prayer book? Which the answer was he probably hadn't. Have you ever looked at the Torah? Not that knowledgeable. That was not a non-starter. But yeah, but it did create some serious problems, as you may have noticed. Yeah, you and then you. Okay, I'm sorry I don't know people's names.
I know Judaism isn't monolithic, but like as far as hot topic social issues, there seems to be a lot in Christianity. Like where, for example, the conservative movement stand on like women rabbis or LGBTQ or abortion.
Okay, slow down there. Okay, so hot topics. Okay, women in Judaism, the conservative movement. Yes. So Of course, women always had an important role in Judaism, but clearly the influence of feminism had a huge impact on modern Judaism. The conservative movement, right, I said balancing tradition and change. Actually, the first woman was ordained as a rabbi in our movement, Amy Eilberg, is a friend, in 1986, the year before me. But in this community, going back to the 1950s, every conservative synagogue had full participation of women in the synagogue. And actually, there was a rabbinic intern, even though she wasn't a rabbi, in the early 70s, well before the movement finally got figured out. One thing about conservative Judaism is we don't move quickly. Because we consider ourselves bound by Jewish law, we always have to work through a process of law, and that is a slow process. One might argue provides stability. It's not like you change with every fad. Other hot topics, abortion. Actually, rabbinic sources, this is not a modern idea. Rabbinic sources make it very clear that in a choice between the life of the mother and the life of the child, the mother's life takes priority. The child actually, if threatening the life of the mother, is viewed as a rodef, a pursuer, and you're obligated to save the life of the mother. And that's based on our reading of the actual text of the Hebrew Bible and not the way it was later translated in the Greek, which is a misunderstanding of the verse from our perspective. So that's not controversial for us, although the question was where it gets conflict. What if it's not the life? What if it's the health or the mental health or even hearing? In our movement, I wouldn't say we're pro-choice because that's not really a category that makes sense for us. We're pro-life as well. But we do prioritize the well-being of the mother, and so in our movement, so we'd say as a rabbinic body, that is a decision for a woman and her decision. We consult her spouse, a rabbi if necessary, or doctor. That's not something we should be legislating. And even no matter what we think, separation of religion and state means that's not something that should be decided by the government. So that's a really quick one. LGBTQ, that unfolded later, but it happened pretty quickly by the time it started to be debated. And so we now, as a movement, do weddings for same-sex couples and ordain clergy, rabbis who are LGBTQ plus. So yeah, I actually called on this person, and then you're next. Do Jews believe in heaven? Wow, you're really making me work today. Well, I guess I would say is ask somebody, ask one, and see what they say. Most Jews would say no. Many Jews would tell you no. That's because you now know more than many Jews about Judaism. And I'll add to your knowledge, the idea of life after death, which may sound familiar to Christians, is already found in, is well sourced in rabbinic sources. There's no one opinion about that question, but there's lots of references. And it's interestingly, among the Pharisees that idea becomes really promoted. The Sadducees, who were the priestly class, did not believe in life after death. They believed that when you die, as it says in the Torah, all the ancestors, they never talk about life after death until some obscure, maybe reference in later books. The patriarchs, matriarchs, they die and they're drawn to their ancestors. It says nothing about any description that says Sha'ol, whatever that means. It's actually the rabbis who developed this idea, probably from other cultures, about a much more developed life after death, of reward and punishment. But like everything else I said, many opinions, and I don't know anybody who's ever really could come back with any, really tell us what happened. So again, I don't know. But I do personally, do I believe that the soul survives? Yes, I do. That there's a body, there's a soul, and that souls, have an influence in the world. I believe that. But that's not all my congregants. And well, you can tell me later what you think. Yeah, somebody over here had a question.
In Israel, is there a separation between?
No, there is not a separation between religion and state in Israel, because Israeli law was based on British mandatory law. There was a period when the British controlled, after World War I, the land of Israel. And they maintained the Turkish legal system, which said every religious community would govern itself for religious purposes, which included issues of who is a member of their religion, marriage, burial, other ritual, divorce. So the British maintain that, and Israel maintains that, which creates a very interesting situation where in Israel, there was even though Zionism was a secular movement and ultra or Orthodox people in the early years rejected Zionism because you can't return to the land of Israel until the arrival of the Messiah. So they rejected early Zionism. Many have since embraced it, but not all. Some continue to be anti-Zionist, which is really interesting and complicated. But there was an agreement that there would be an establishment of a chief rabbinate. It would be Orthodox, and they have a lot of political power. So interestingly, all the non-Orthodox movements that I described, there's a lot of imbalance in terms of power, money, recognition in Israel for movements like ours, and that's something we deal with all the time. So, yeah, it's a really big and complicated question. Yeah.
I came late, so I didn't hear the first part of your lecture. So, do Jewish people believe that Jesus was a prophet?
No. So we believe that Jesus was likely a teacher, probably a rabbi, most likely, and I don't think, Caitlin, I think Reverend Caitlin, Pastor Caitlin, who is that you're holding? What a cutie, okay. Believe that he probably was a disciple of the school of Hillel, and a lot of his teaching is very consistent with the Pharisaic school of Hillel. Now again, the idea that Pharisees are somehow bad, that's much later. That's not, again, but that's a big topic. The Jewishness of Jesus, I can't do justice to it. But yeah, no, we don't recognize Jesus in any special status as a prophet, as a Messiah, let alone as a Son of God. So, and that, in the Middle Ages, like the blindness of the Jews in not recognizing that truth is kind of at the source of a lot of anti-Jewish rhetoric and anti-Semitic attitudes. So that's a big disagreement. Yes. Wait, I was pointed there, and then you're next.
You on the slide it talked about back with Martin Luther that Jews could not proselytize.
Uh-huh.
Was that a common practice before?
Yeah, everybody was doing that.
I actually thought it was just a genetic. You're in the tribe of Israel, and
Nope. No, a person, well, the question of who is defined as a Jew, the traditional definition going back to the Roman period was that a person is Jewish if they're born of a Jewish mother or converted to Judaism. And that was always a possibility. Interestingly, was not the definition of the Israelites, because you look at the Bible, everyone, like all kinds of Jewish leaders, Moses, Joseph, all kinds of folks marry non-Jewish women. And it seems like just bringing them into the tribe was enough. It's only in about the 2nd century that the rabbis define a process for conversion. But Judaism does not, one can convert. Yeah. Yes, you were going to ask.
I was going to ask about not the religious aspect, but the practice of kosher kitchens and things like that.
Dietary laws. So already in the Bible, you have descriptions of what Jews can and can't eat. We call that kashrut, or keeping kosher, separating. So that's a really good example. There's not that much said. It just 3 times it says that you shouldn't you shouldn't eat a cow with and a calf and its mother's milk, right? 3 times it says it. Nowhere does it say what that actually means, and the way that comes with practice is you don't eat milk and meat together. Meat has to be slaughtered in a special fashion, not blessed, but just slaughtered in a special fashion. And so you don't cook milk and meat together, and you keep some kind of separation of time, and even having separate dishes for each of them. And so that's the dietary system. Passover adds even more restrictions about what you can and can't eat. So that, again, that's there's like certain things that over history separate Jews from other people. Dietary laws is one of them. Practice of circumcision for Jewish children, for male children on the 8th day, and Sabbath, observing Sabbath on Saturday, which the church, in order to distinguish itself, moves to Sunday, also distinguishes in very distinct ways, and becomes sources of tension between Jews and non-Jews. So,
Would you talk about the similarity between the Muslims and the Jews?
great. You know, I want to actually, in the 1 minute I have left, unbelievable, I want to actually answer your question more broadly about the kind of similarities between Muslims and Jews. Well, you'll see similarities between Christianity and Judaism because, you know, Judaism was, or ancient Israel, right, biblical. But both Judaism and Christianity kind of each go in their own direction. Islam is influenced later by both faiths and takes some of the same things. I can't do justice. But what I don't want to not say is we're living in a very difficult time vis-a-vis Israel. And I will tell you, there was tremendous progress in the relationship between Jews and Lutherans after the Holocaust, where they said Lutherans did serious soul searching and did serious work to address the anti-Jewish and anti-Semitic elements that have a connection of, however we see it, to horrific things. And it was a very important time. But there was also a very long and challenging relationship between the liberal Protestant churches and Jews about Israel and how we each understand Israel. And I think part of what you see helps you understand why one may or may not agree, and I have my own issues with the present Israeli government, but the need for a Jewish state, which is not new, it has deep historic roots. So this idea that we're somehow like invaders or colonists is a denial of 3,000 years of Jewish history. And that's very hard when liberal Protestant churches take sides in this debate. So that's a lot that I just said, and I'm done now, so I'm going to leave. But no, really, I'm willing to stay on and talk or come back or have somebody else who can talk about that piece because it is big and important and has gigantic consequences for what's going on right now, and it's very painful. And it's painful in the relationship, but it's particularly painful to see the suffering. As one very dear Christian minister of mine said to me right after the attack on October 7th, and it was with its heart. And the subsequent war, she said to me, you know, Harold, there is, in the competition for suffering, there are no winners. In the competition for suffering, there are no winners. And that has stuck with me, and I think it's incredibly true. And I feel, there's deep pain about what's happening right now. And that's a whole other conversation that we could have. But that's the reason I came today, because I want to be able to say that. So thank you, my last minute. I went over 1 minute, but thank you, Fred. And thanks for your great questions. You really kept me on my toes. You know, I'm retired, so I'm not quite used to working this hard.